May 1942. Northern Burma near the Indian border. A ragged column of British, Indian, and Burmese soldiers stumbles through monsoon rain towards safety in India. They have been retreating for 5 months, the longest retreat in British military history. Behind them, Japanese forces have conquered all of Burma, severing the vital supply route to China and threatening India itself. These exhausted men have fought through jungle, across rivers, up mountains, and through disease-infested lowlands. They have been bombed, outflanked, and defeated repeatedly. Malaria, dysentery, and cholera have killed more men than Japanese bullets. Units have disintegrated. Equipment has been abandoned. The wounded have been left behind. Of the forces that began the campaign, only a fraction survived to reach India. Lieutenant General William Slim, who will soon take command of these defeated forces, looks at his men and sees not cowards but soldiers broken by impossible conditions. He recognizes that the Burma campaign has been a disaster of planning, leadership, and logistics. But he also sees that this war is far from over. Burma must be reconquered, and these same soldiers, rebuilt, retrained, and properly led, will do it. The Burma campaign would last nearly 4 years, from January 1942 to August 1945. It would be fought across some of the world's most hostile terrain: dense jungle, high mountains, wide rivers, and disease-ridden valleys. It would involve British, Indian, African, Chinese, and American forces fighting against Japanese troops who had mastered jungle warfare. It would witness some of WWII's most desperate sieges, most audacious special operations, and most innovative tactical developments. Yet today, the Burma campaign is largely forgotten. Overshadowed by the war in Europe and the island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific, Burma became known as the Forgotten War, a theater where men fought and died in obscurity, their sacrifices unrecognized by publics focused elsewhere. This is their story, a tale of defeat and redemption, of suffering and endurance, of a war fought in hell that nobody remembers. Burma, a British colony since 1886, occupied a crucial strategic position in Southeast Asia. The country bordered India to the west, China to the north and east, and Thailand to the southeast. Through Burma ran the Burma Road, the vital supply route carrying American and British aid to Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese forces fighting Japan. Controlling Burma meant controlling access to China, threatening India, and securing resources including oil, rubber, and rice. For Japan, conquering Burma served multiple strategic objectives. It would sever Allied support to China, forcing Chiang either to negotiate or collapse. It would secure Japan's western flank, preventing any British counteroffensive from India. It would provide a defensive barrier protecting the oil-rich Dutch East Indies and Thailand. And eventually, Burma could serve as a springboard for invasion of India, the jewel of the British Empire. For Britain, losing Burma was catastrophic. The retreat from Burma represented another humiliating defeat following Singapore, Hong Kong, and Malaya. It threatened India with invasion and placed immense strain on already overstretched resources. Reconquering Burma became essential not just strategically but psychologically, proof that British forces could defeat the Japanese in jungle warfare. For China, Burma was the difference between survival and starvation. With Burma cut off, supplies to China had to come by air over the hump, the Himalayan mountains, at tremendous cost and limited capacity. Reopening land routes through Burma was critical to keeping China in the war. For America, Burma was secondary to other theaters but still significant. American General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell commanded Chinese forces in Burma and pushed for offensive operations to reopen supply routes to China. American aircraft flew supplies over the hump, and American Special Forces, Merrill's Marauders, would fight some of the war's most grueling campaigns in Burma's jungles. Japan's invasion of Burma began on January 20, 1942, as the 15th Army under Lieutenant General Shigiro Iida advanced from Thailand. The Japanese fielded approximately 35,000 troops initially, facing roughly 40,000 British, Indian, and Burmese defenders. On paper, the odds favored the defenders. In practice, Japanese superiority in training, leadership, tactics, and air power quickly became apparent. The campaign began with the Battle of Moulmein, where Japanese forces crossed the Salween River and quickly overwhelmed the defending garrison. The British commander, Lieutenant General Thomas Hutton, ordered retreat rather than risk encirclement. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout the campaign. British forces would establish defensive positions. Japanese forces would infiltrate through the jungle and appear on their flanks or rear, and British commanders would order withdrawal to avoid being cut off. The Japanese employed infiltration tactics that bewildered British commanders trained in conventional European warfare. Small units would move through dense jungle, appearing where the British thought passage impossible. Roadblocks would suddenly materialize behind British positions. At night, Japanese patrols would probe defenses, creating panic and confusion. Japanese air superiority meant constant bombing and strafing of British positions and supply columns. By late February, British forces had withdrawn across the Sitang River, only to have the bridge blown prematurely while thousands of troops remained on the eastern bank. The 17th Indian Division was decimated, losing most of its equipment and over 3,000 men. The disaster at Sitang Bridge exemplified the campaign's chaos and poor decision-making. Rangoon, Burma's capital and main port, fell on March 8, 1942. General Harold Alexander, who had replaced Hutton, ordered the city evacuated to save his forces from encirclement. With Rangoon's port gone, all supplies had to come overland from India, a logistical nightmare. The retreat continued northward, British and Chinese forces falling back before relentless Japanese pressure. Lieutenant General William Slim arrived to take command of Burma Corps in March, inheriting a deteriorating situation. Slim was a thinking soldier's soldier, practical, unpretentious, and realistic about his force's limitations. He recognized immediately that the campaign was lost and focused on saving his army. Over the following weeks, Slim conducted a fighting retreat, holding positions long enough to extract his forces, then withdrawing before being encircled. The monsoon rains began in May, turning roads into rivers of mud and halting major operations. By May 20, 1942, the last British forces crossed into India, completing the longest retreat in British military history, 1,000 miles in 5 months. Of approximately 40,000 men who began the campaign, perhaps 12,000 reached India as organized units. The remainder were dead, captured, missing, or scattered. Burma was lost. The period from mid-1942 through 1943 represented the nadir of Allied fortunes in Burma. British forces, retreating to India, needed time to rebuild, retrain, and recover. Chinese forces had withdrawn into Yunnan province, licking their wounds. American efforts focused on flying supplies over the hump, a dangerous route over the Himalayas where weather, altitude, and mechanical failures killed hundreds of air crews. The Japanese, meanwhile, consolidated control over Burma. They proclaimed Burmese independence under a puppet government, though real power remained with the Japanese military. The Burma Independence Army, initially welcomed as liberators, quickly became disillusioned with Japanese brutality and exploitation. Construction began on the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, the Death Railway, using Allied POWs and Asian laborers as slave labor under horrific conditions. But the Japanese also faced challenges. Burma's vast distances, poor infrastructure, and hostile terrain made consolidation difficult. Guerrilla resistance, particularly from Karen and Kachin ethnic minorities who remained loyal to the British, harassed Japanese garrisons. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of jungle, and increasingly, Japanese forces in Burma were starved of reinforcements and supplies as the empire's situation deteriorated elsewhere. For the British, 1940-21943 meant painful rebuilding. Slim, now commanding the newly formed 14th Army, recognized that defeating the Japanese required fundamental changes. His forces needed better jungle training, better tactics, better logistics, better medical care, and better leadership. Slim set about creating an army that could fight and win in Burma's impossible terrain. The Arakan Campaign of late 1942, early 1943 was a false start, a limited British offensive into the Arakan region of western Burma that ended in defeat when Japanese forces infiltrated British positions and forced another retreat. The campaign demonstrated that British forces still hadn't mastered jungle warfare, and that simply throwing troops into the jungle without proper preparation was futile. One bright spot emerged from the dark years: Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindits. Wingate, an unconventional and controversial officer, proposed deep penetration operations behind Japanese lines. Small columns would infiltrate far into Burma, supplied by air, disrupting Japanese communications and logistics while proving that British forces could operate in the jungle. Operation Longcloth, launched in February 1943, saw approximately 3,000 Chindits penetrate deep into Burma. They blew bridges, cut railway lines, ambushed convoys, and generally created chaos behind Japanese lines. The operation was militarily insignificant. The Japanese quickly repaired the damage, but psychologically invaluable. The Chindits proved British soldiers could fight in the jungle, could be supplied by air, and could compete with Japanese infiltration tactics. The cost was high. Only about 2,000 Chindits returned, many broken by disease and exhaustion. But the publicity was enormous. Wingate became a hero, Churchill demanded more Chindit operations, and Allied morale received a much-needed boost. A second, larger Chindit operation would follow in 1944. In March 1944, the Japanese launched their most ambitious offensive of the Burma Campaign, Operation Yugo, aimed at capturing the twin cities of Imphal and Kohima in northeast India. Lieutenant General Riniam Mutaguchi commanded 3 divisions, approximately 85,000 men, tasked with destroying British forces in the region, capturing supply bases, and opening the road to India. The offensive initially achieved surprise. Japanese forces advanced rapidly, cutting the road between Imphal and Kohima and besieging both cities. The sieges that followed became epics of endurance. At Kohima, a small garrison held a tiny perimeter against waves of Japanese attacks. The battle centered on Garrison Hill, where fighting was so close that opposing forces threw grenades at each other across a tennis court. British and Indian troops held by their fingernails while reinforcements rushed forward. At Imphal, a much larger garrison, approximately 155,000 troops, was surrounded but well supplied by air. Slim had anticipated the Japanese offensive and concentrated forces accordingly. Instead of panicking at being surrounded, British and Indian troops held their positions while Japanese supply lines, already tenuous, collapsed completely. The Japanese had gambled everything on a quick victory before the monsoon. They carried minimal supplies, expecting to capture British stocks. When the British held and air supply kept the garrisons fed and armed, Japanese forces began starving. Mutaguchi drove his men forward with fanatic determination, ordering attacks even when units reported they lacked food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The siege of Kohima was relieved in mid-April after brutal fighting. The siege of Imphal continued until late June, but by then the Japanese offensive was clearly defeated. Japanese forces began withdrawing in July, pursued by British and Indian divisions. The retreat became a rout. Starving, diseased Japanese soldiers stumbled back toward Burma, dying by the thousands from starvation and sickness. The Battle of Imphal Kohima was the largest defeat suffered by Japanese land forces to that point in the war. Of 85,000 Japanese troops committed, approximately 53,000 became casualties, 30,000 killed. British and Indian casualties totaled about 16,700. More importantly, the battle broke Japanese power in Burma and set the stage for the Allied reconquest. While Imphal Kohima dominated attention, another campaign unfolded in northern Burma. American General Joseph Stilwell commanded Chinese forces, trained and equipped by Americans, advancing from Yunnan province, aiming to reopen land routes to China. Stilwell was abrasive, stubborn, and difficult, nicknamed Vinegar Joe for his sour disposition, but also courageous and determined. Stilwell's Chinese divisions, despite initial Japanese skepticism, fought effectively. They advanced down the Hukong Valley, engaging Japanese forces in brutal jungle fighting. Supporting them were American Special Forces, the 5,307th Composite Unit, Provisional, better known as Merrill's Marauders after their commander, Brigadier General Frank Merrill. Merrill's Marauders conducted long-range penetration operations similar to the Chindits, marching through jungle, outflanking Japanese positions, and operating behind enemy lines. The Marauders fought a series of savage engagements in spring 1944, culminating in the capture of Myitkyina Airfield in May. The town of Myitkyina fell only in August after a prolonged siege. The Marauders paid a terrible price. Of 3,000 men, only about 200 were still combat effective by war's end. Disease, exhaustion, and combat casualties destroyed the unit, but they accomplished their mission, opening northern Burma and enabling construction of the Ledo Road connecting India to China. With Japanese forces broken at Imphal and Kohima and pushed back in the north, Slim's 14th Army launched the reconquest of Burma in late 1944. This was Slim at his finest, employing innovative tactics, meticulous logistics, and aggressive leadership to destroy Japanese forces. Slim's plan was brilliant in its deception. He convinced the Japanese that the main British offensive would continue down the Arakan coast in western Burma. Meanwhile, his main force advanced rapidly through central Burma toward Mandalay. The Japanese, expecting attack from the west, were caught off balance when British armor emerged from supposedly impassable terrain. The advance proceeded with remarkable speed. The Battle of Meiktila in March 1945 saw British armor capture this crucial communications hub, cutting Japanese supply lines and creating chaos. Mandalay fell after fierce fighting. Rangoon, the ultimate objective, was captured on May 3, 1945, just before the monsoon would have halted operations. The Japanese 28th Army, attempting to break out from the Arakan, was caught crossing the Sitang River and virtually annihilated, a reversal of the 1942 Sitang Bridge disaster. Of approximately 17,000 Japanese troops attempting the crossing, only about 6,000 reached safety. The Burma Campaign ended with Japanese forces in full retreat. Statistics alone cannot convey the Burma Campaign's horror. British and Commonwealth forces suffered approximately 71,000 casualties, including 14,000 killed. Chinese forces lost over 60,000. Japanese losses exceeded 185,000 dead, but numbers don't capture the nature of suffering in Burma. Disease killed more men than combat. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, scrub typhus, and various tropical diseases were constant threats. In 1940-21943, for every man evacuated with wounds, 120 were evacuated with disease. The sick rate in some units exceeded 50%. Slim recognized that medical care was as important as ammunition. The 14th Army developed excellent medical services, reducing disease casualties dramatically. The jungle itself was an enemy. Dense vegetation that could hide an army, leeches that covered exposed skin within minutes, insects that carried disease, heat that exhausted men carrying heavy loads, monsoon rains that lasted months, turning trails into rivers and rivers into lakes, mountains that rose thousands of feet. The terrain was so difficult that both sides often bypassed positions simply because approaching them was impossible. Logistics were nightmarish. Every bullet, every meal, every bandage had to be carried hundreds of miles over roads that barely existed. Air supply became critical. Both sides relied heavily on airdrops. The Burma Campaign was the first major campaign where entire armies were supplied primarily by air. Without the Dakota transport aircraft, neither side could have operated. The psychological strain was immense. Soldiers went weeks without seeing civilization. Combat was typically at close range in dense jungle. You might not see an enemy until he was yards away. Japanese infiltration tactics meant you were never secure. Wounded men who couldn't walk faced abandonment. The knowledge that capture meant torture and death motivated desperate resistance. Underlying the entire Burma campaign was the China question. The Allied goal was keeping China in the war, tying down Japanese forces that would otherwise fight elsewhere. The Burma Road, connecting Lashio in Burma to Kunming in China, was vital for moving supplies to Chiang Kai-shek's forces. When Burma fell in 1942, the Burma Road was cut. Supplies to China had to fly over the hump, the Himalayas, at tremendous cost. American transport aircraft flew dangerous missions over 15,000-foot mountains in all weather. Hundreds of aircraft were lost. Tonnage delivered was never sufficient. The Lido Road, constructed from India through northern Burma to connect with the Burma Road, was an engineering marvel and massive boondoggle. The construction cost billions, took years, and employed thousands of workers. When finally completed in early 1945, it arrived too late to significantly affect the war. The debate over whether resources spent on the Lido Road could have been better used elsewhere continues. Stilwell's relationship with Chiang was toxic. Stilwell considered Chiang corrupt, incompetent, and more interested in fighting Chinese communists than Japanese. Chiang considered Stilwell arrogant, disrespectful of Chinese sovereignty, and ignorant of political realities. Their mutual contempt complicated operations and eventually led to Stilwell's recall in October 1944. The Burma campaign's reconquest belongs to William Slim more than any other individual. Slim took defeated, demoralized forces in 1942 and transformed them into the 14th Army that crushed Japanese forces in 1940-41945. His achievement ranks among the great military turnarounds in history. Slim's leadership was based on practical principles. He trained his forces specifically for jungle warfare, small unit tactics, patrolling, ambush, rapid response. He emphasized air supply, pioneering techniques that allowed entire divisions to operate supplied only from the air. He improved medical services, dramatically reducing disease casualties. He selected aggressive, competent commanders and relieved those who failed. Most importantly, Slim communicated with his soldiers. He visited units, talked to men, explained the strategic situation, and made them feel valued. The 14th Army, fighting in obscurity in a forgotten theater, needed to know their sacrifices mattered. Slim ensured they did. Slim's tactical innovations were equally important. He recognized that British forces could outmaneuver the Japanese if supplied by air. Instead of fearing being cut off, Slim's divisions welcomed it. They would hold supplied boxes, while mobile forces attacked Japanese communications. At Imphal, Slim turned the Japanese tactic of encirclement against them, destroying Japanese forces that surrounded his well-supplied garrisons. The role of Burmese forces adds complexity to the narrative. The Burma Independence Army, led by Aung San, father of Aung San Suu Kyi, initially collaborated with Japan, seeing the Japanese as liberators from British colonialism. Thousands of Burmese joined Japanese-sponsored forces. Disillusionment came quickly. Japanese occupation was brutal, exploitative, and dismissive of Burmese aspirations. By 1945, Aung San had secretly contacted the British and agreed to switch sides. In March 1945, the Burma National Army, as it was then called, rose against the Japanese in a coordinated revolt that aided the British advance. This collaboration complicated post-war politics. Aung San negotiated Burmese independence, achieved in 1948, but he was assassinated in 1947, leaving Burma's political future uncertain. The country descended into civil war and military dictatorship, consequences still evident today. Why did the Burma Campaign become the forgotten war? Multiple factors contributed. The campaign occurred simultaneously with more dramatic events: D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. It involved primarily British, Indian, and colonial forces, receiving limited attention in American media. It occurred in remote terrain far from correspondence and cameras, and it ended anticlimactically. Rangoon fell the same week as Germany's surrender, overshadowed by VE Day. The soldiers who fought there felt the neglect deeply. They coined bitter nicknames: the Forgotten Army, the Forgotten War. When British newspapers focused on Montgomery in Europe while ignoring Slim in Burma, the resentment was palpable. Veterans returned to Britain and found nobody knew or cared where they had been or what they had done. Yet the campaign's significance was real. It kept China in the war, tying down Japanese forces. It demonstrated that Allied forces could defeat Japanese troops in jungle warfare. It pioneered air supply techniques used in future conflicts. It prevented invasion of India, and it represented a remarkable military turnaround, from humiliating defeat to crushing victory. In 1956, William Slim, by then Field Marshal Viscount Slim and Governor-General of Australia, reflected on the Burma Campaign. It was not an easy war, nor a short one. The conditions under which it was fought were among the most trying any soldiers have ever had to endure. Yet I do not think there is any force in the world, any army in history, of which I would rather have been a member. The men who fought in Burma endured conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. They fought in jungles so dense that units lost contact within yards. They slogged through monsoon rains that turned the world into mud. They battled disease that hospitalized more men than enemy fire. They operated in obscurity, their sacrifices unrecognized by nations focused on other theaters. Yet they prevailed. The longest retreat in British military history became one of the most complete victories. Defeated, demoralized forces were rebuilt into an army that crushed Japanese forces. Innovation, leadership, and endurance overcame terrain, disease, and a determined enemy. The Burma Campaign deserves to be remembered, not just for the battles fought and won, but for what it reveals about human capacity for endurance and adaptation. In the worst terrain, under the worst conditions, against a skilled and determined enemy, Allied forces not only survived but triumphed. The soldiers who fought there deserved better than to be forgotten. They fought in hell and won. Their story, of defeat and redemption, of suffering and perseverance, of ordinary men accomplishing extraordinary things, deserves to be told and remembered. The forgotten war should be forgotten no longer.